Okay, thank you, Alamayu. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this paper on Ethiopia, Emily Schmidt, who's sitting back there, wave Emily, and Admasu Schifferau, who is sitting someplace in Germany right now. So he will not be waving his hand, I don't think. I looked at the title that I picked here, Economic Growth Without Structural Transformation, and I thought, that seems a bit negative, and maybe I don't have the proper perspective on this. And so it reminded me of a story of when I was a young man, many, many years ago, dating this really nice young woman, and she said to me she filled up the gas tank whenever it reached 3/4. And I thought, 3/4? And she said, yes, when it gets to 3/4 empty. Aha, that's a different perspective. Well, some 25, 30 years later, I've been married to this wonderful young woman for that time, and there's another perspective that's very good about this, and it's saying, you know what, we need to buy 3/4 tank of gas. So there's a planning perspective in recognizing and looking at things a little bit differently. So let's call this economic growth with incipient structural transformation. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in Ethiopia. And I think Ethiopia must be one of the most exciting countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The pace of change there in the last decade is remarkable. And I want to present some things about that here. I want to talk about, to some extent, the structural shift in the economy. That's not the most exciting part. There's a rapid urbanization that's happening a lot faster than the official data would suggest. There's an enormous change in infrastructure, in electricity, in telecommunications, and education, and health, and those things are laying the groundwork for growth and poverty reduction. And then I want to talk about a few key policies that relate to our issues here, implications of agricultural investments, land policies, and then some on industrial structure and the constraints in industry. So if you look at this graph on the left-hand axis, we have billion birr. We're looking at real GDP, real terms, and if you see at the far left, 99-2000, the country in 99-2000 has got about 60 billion birr in GDP, and by the end of the period, 2008-09, it's doubled. They've doubled their output in that span of 9 years. You'll also notice the black line at the top. The black line at the top is giving us, on the right-hand axis, agricultural share of GDP. And you can see that it's fallen. It's fallen from, about 50% to about 42% over that period. So there's been a substantial shift in the share of ag in GDP. But if you look at the different colored bars, the bottom one is agriculture, and it's grown a lot, that green area. But if you look really hard, then you look at the red area, and that's industry. And the red area hasn't expanded that much. So we've had a shift. We see that that agriculture share in GDP has gone down. What's gone up as a share? And the big thing is the light blue, the other private services. So you've had a big expansion in other services, for that matter construction, but not much in industry. We take a look at the structure of industry here, and again, the rates in agriculture over this period, 7% per year. This is in real terms. Industry's growing quickly. Much of that is because construction is considered part of industry, and they've had a big investment boom in Ethiopia. And you notice other private services, and a big part of that is wholesale and retail trade. So it's not the kind of structural transformation that we're perhaps hoping for. We're thinking that we're going to get this big industrialization, and that has yet to happen. But another big change is in Ethiopia is urbanization. And if you look at the official statistics, you would think that maybe Ethiopia isn't urbanizing very fast. And if you look at the second column here, the growth rate in urban population from 84 to 2007, about 4% per year. Not so quick, not so rapid urbanization. And you can see at the top, the official numbers say that urbanization went from 11% to about 16% of the population over that period. But that definition of urban is essentially unique to Ethiopia in the sense that it's an administrative definition whereby places as small as 2,000 people can be considered urban. And if you go to an agglomeration definition, where we're looking at agglomerated areas of 50,000 population or more, and the population within 1 hour travel time, then you can see a much different picture of urbanization in Ethiopia. It says that in 1984, the country was actually much less urbanized than the official data suggests, right? Lots of little villages of 2,000 people considered urban. So if you talk about what are major agglomerations, back in 84, you only have 3.7% of the country living in or near cities of 50,000 people or more. And by 2007, you're up to 14%. It means that after that period, those two numbers are pretty close. The official number and the agglomeration number, 15.9 and 14.2. But if you look at the growth rates in the periods, they're vastly different. 4.2% by the official definition, 8.9% if you look at agglomerated areas. It means that Ethiopia is actually urbanizing very rapidly. And you get a sense of this with the two bars. The bottom bar is line is the agglomeration index, and you can see it starts out lower than the upper line, which is the official estimate of millions of people who are urban. And now in 2007, we've converged in terms of estimates of total population in urban areas. Not only have we had urbanization, we've had massive investments in infrastructure. And Emily and Makamu in Ethiopia did the GIS analysis. And here's a map of Ethiopia, and it's showing travel time in 1984. And I want you to focus to some extent on this big green area, which is the places where it's more than 10 hours travel time to a city of 50,000 or more. And then the bright red areas, well, that's about around 1 hour or less than 3 hours. Look what happens over time. 1984, 1994, 2007. So major investments in road networks, as well as expanding urban populations and new towns reaching that threshold of 50,000, means that the highlands of Ethiopia, which is essentially all that yellow and red area, are now much, much better connected. And you can look at that in another way. Remember, one of our themes is perspective here. If you focus on the three bars on the left side, Ethiopia 1984, 94, and 2007, you can see the red bars are, this is the percentage of the population more than 10 hours from a major city. And you can see it goes down from about 40% to about 12%. In other words, back in 84, you've got 40% of your population more than 10 hours away from a city of 50,000 people. There's a huge remote population in Ethiopia back in 1984, and with those investments in infrastructure, that number came down to about 12. If you look at 5 to 10 hours plus the greater than 10, in other words, how many people are more than 5 hours from a city, that's fallen from 80% to less than 40%. And just by comparison, look at Mozambique, 1997, you had about 45% of the population more than 5 hours from a major city. That's fallen some to less than 40%. And then Nigeria from 20 to around 17%. And you'll notice that the people that are very remote are rather small as a share of population in Nigeria, around 5%, or even now in Mozambique. But that's a huge change in the country in terms of being very far from a city. I'll skip this in the interest of time. But another major change is in electricity. And I think one of the things that's really striking about this is look at the units on the right-hand side. It's watts per person. That was not kilowatts per person, and it was not megawatts per person. This was watts per person. This is electricity capacity generation. And you can see, well, back in 1958, it's essentially nothing. But even now, from 2000 to 2009 or 2010, we go from on the order of 5 watts per person to about 25 watts per person. It's increased by a factor of almost 5. It's a very low base, but it's changing the possibilities for industrialization and productivity. And Jabo has a very nice study on that, and it was referred to yesterday briefly. And then finally, we talked about remoteness, about urbanization. Cell phones, of course, a big part of changes. How many cell phones are out there in Ethiopia? And that's the red bars. And you can see from almost nothing in 2003, we're close to 10 million. And you say, okay, yeah, that's the story everywhere. I suppose it is. But what a difference it's making to a country that had so much remoteness in the past. If you look at what percentage of the population is in a connected area, now Ethiopia 5.3%. That's great. Africa 32%. So there's a long way to go, but a lot of progress has been made nonetheless. And then I'll just point out to one other thing that's laying the foundation for this growth and transformation is just the education. And you can see this is net primary school enrollment, and you can see Ethiopia going from 21.9% in 91 to 71% in 2007, and a very similar trend for girls as well. And again, it's starting from a base that's much lower than the other countries that are shown here, and the countries that we're looking at in our study. So what's been happening to poverty and over time as we've had this growth, and what's been happening rural-urban? And you can see in the blue line is the rural areas, and we go down from about 48% poverty to about 42 or 40. And urban is hovering around 36%. So as we discussed a little bit yesterday, here's another case, rural poverty greater than urban poverty. The data that we have suggests it's been going down. There's a lot of growth in GDP in the last 6 years, and we're waiting for the next National Household Survey to be able to say what's happened to poverty since then. But if we look at a more limited survey, the Ethiopian Rural Household Survey, you get a change in self-reported perceptions of poverty. And if you look at the 2 bars on the left, the blue and the red, those indicate people who consider themselves destitute or poor. And that has gone way down from about 40% in 1994 to 13% in 2009. And that's a panel data set IFPRI's collected with Oxford and Addis Ababa University. So if we look at growth strategy, what do you do now? IFPRI had done the analysis on the CADIP. What are the implications of increased agricultural growth? And what we find is, in the interest of time, if we continue along the path that we've been on in Ethiopia over the last 10 years, this analysis suggests that poverty goes down from about 40% to about 23% by 2015. And if you increase agricultural productivity along the lines of the CADP plans, poverty is reduced further. And then finally, if you have additional non-agricultural growth, exogenous non-agricultural growth, it falls to 13%. Another big issue is rural-urban migration. And what I'd like you to look at is the far bars on the left, the labor force survey from 2004 or 5, and you can, the blue bars are the rural to rural migration. And according to the data, 40% of the migration is from rural areas to other rural areas. But if we change the definition of what rural and urban are, if we go to a definition where we say you move to a county where any part of that county is in an agglomerated, has an agglomerated area of 50,000 people or more, then the picture changes. Migration isn't rural 40%, it's rural 25%, and to these urban waredas, urban counties, you have substantial rural to urban county migration around 50%. And so in Ethiopia, a big issue is land policies. There are regional government proclamations that restrict access to rural land. You have to be a rural resident. It's difficult to transfer land, and it's difficult to transfer land rights, even use rights. And these are the kind of policies that inhibit rural-urban migration there. And then quickly on manufacturing and some of the constraints there. On the modern industry, it's very small. You saw the other slide. And you can see that 34% in terms of firms are food and beverage. And then you'll notice the non-metal being very large, and then we're picking up the construction there, cement. And then we look at, but in terms of the structure of the firms, you have many small firms. 70% of firms employ less than 50 workers. A high degree of survival of the big firms and a big turnover of the smaller firms. Nearly 60% in the bottom 2 quintals exit the market year to year. And then you have a substantial number of firms. Because there are a substantial number of firms that exit, you've got a high degree of job creation and job loss. And the national data also show that many firms engage in virtually no investment. Small firms rarely scale up, and entrepreneurs prefer to start additional small firms rather than reinvest in existing small firms. And it was mentioned briefly by Stefan yesterday, industrial growth has occurred primarily from trading companies that convert to manufacturing rather than from small and medium firms that grow into large enterprises. And one of the reasons for that seems to be that traders have this knowledge and wealth of experience of local market conditions. And they use that to switch the area in which their firm operates. But that local knowledge and the knowledge of the markets is crucial for them. Two big constraints: credit, in terms of credit ceilings and credit rationing, that especially after 2007. And in general, only large firms were able to access the credit. Another constraint is uncertainty in terms of electricity shortages, as well as a lack of secondhand markets in machinery and equipment. So that makes the investments more irreversible. So, two key development strategy issues. One is the sectoral allocation of public investments. The paper that James presented yesterday talked a lot about that. But Ethiopia invested a lot in agriculture. in the past 10, 15 years, the agricultural development-led industrialization strategy. And so the question is now, should there be a big increase in urban investment or continue along the current path? And one thing about Ethiopia is the government actually put its money where its mouth was. It said we were going to invest in agriculture, and it did. And if you look here, 1999-2000 and 2007-08, real investment, real development budget goes from a little under 10 billion to over 30 billion. It triples. But look at the rural investments, and those go up from about 4 to about, I guess that's 18. An enormous increase in rural investments, investments in agriculture and in rural infrastructure as part of that development strategy. The other big issue, the land and migration regulations, whether to ease those regulations, whether to, in effect, allow more rural-urban migration. So finally, the presentation that James made yesterday was looking at trade-offs. And I think the government and the people all recognize that urbanization and industrialization are a crucial part of development and accelerating growth, and that's definitely, there's going to be a shift in spending towards that. However, our analysis is suggesting that given the very low levels of GDP per capita and the high share of agriculture and the high concentration of poverty in rural areas, and most important, the realistic possibilities of increasing agricultural productivity, it makes a lot of sense for Ethiopia to continue to heavily invest in agriculture, especially if you have an objective of reducing poverty overall in the country. Amasaganello.